The Angular Shank Loading Model is essentially a loading model in adjusting the angles of your athlete's foot position in any posterior training, maybe even some squatting methods. But this particular model will systematically show you how to position your feet based upon your loading in a way to build a posterior chain resilience for your athletes. And we'll get right into it. If I can get this to change, there we go. So when you're sprinting, as you can see on the right here, you have your, if you watch your athletes and video them from behind, you can see that their feet are in a wider position, especially coming out of a stance. Stronger, more powerful athletes make it a little wider. But the point is that you're building, you're positioning their foot, the width of their feet in a loading model zone. So basically strength is basically 0 to 5 meters, which will then require a wider angle of the shank, which is the lower limb model, but it's the whole leg then. So it's a wider stance. So the strength, when you're doing strength exercise, and we'll define what strength is here in a second, but then the power phase, as you start accelerating between 5 and 15 meters, is essentially a little bit more of a narrower stance, and you'll see how this applies later. And then obviously the speed can be between 10 and 20 meters. Some athletes that are not very fast, they may get the top end speed around 10 meters or close, I should say. At least they're in that technique. They may not be in that top end speed yet, but they're in that technique. And their feet are a little bit more narrow. So, and anything beyond that. But what I've done is essentially place the foot position into the phase that we're training. So, and it's pretty simple. When I say strength phases, the strength loading zone, you will have a wider stance, okay? And that is loading above 80%. Now, me using a block method, so if I'm in a strength phase for my legs and I'm above 80%, I usually do it the whole week above 80 or 85 or 92 or even 120%. Now, I will have a wider stance to match up the strength phase. The strength phase also has a lot to do with isometric strength. So whether I'm in a triphasic phase of isometric, eccentrics, it's usually above 80%. And what happens obviously is that 80%, once I hit 80%, you're in a wider stance. The power zone is between 55 and 80%. Anything below 80, so 75% would be a more narrower stance. And then the next zone where your feet will be together, and I'll cover lifts specifically for this so you can see what I'm talking about, between 55 and it should probably be 50 to 25%. But based upon your model, you can make the judgment. I'm not splitting hairs here with the percentages. I'm just giving you my ranges. And again, remember that as you run, your feet start out wider and become more narrow through a sprint. So this is what we're correlating to. This is Sport-Specificity, and I'm matching up loading models based upon the foot position of the sprint. Now, so for example, when you're doing training on a glute ham hyper, so you're looking at top of a glute ham hyper. Here's where the thighs would be, the knees, then the foot goes into this pad. The foot will be placed here. So if you remember, the red line's a strength phase. And with that red line being right there, these two red lines, you can see the athlete's angle of their legs will be wider. Then you move them in 3-4 inches maybe each side, and this would be the power phase. So the loading of the power phase is roughly 55 to 80%. And then the speed phase, which is roughly 25 to 55, or yeah, 55%, I believe in the last slide, you would see that your athlete has a narrow stance. So when you're peaking your athletes, there should be a more narrow stance, especially in a sport where the gait cycle is important. And you're obviously doing explosive movements at all time. And then there's other things that tie into this. I have the integrated foot roll method. I also have a three-way foot position method that needs to be addressed, which I'll make future videos about soon. But so you can see in the glute ham and reverse hyper. So with the glute ham, this athlete has a wide stance. You can see how the model is, and I like a wider glute ham with a wide plate on it, and it's for this reason. Loading is above 80% to 120. And again, this is for athletes. I'm not saying that a power lifter should go into the speed stuff. He can in the off season, but if your stance is more wider, much more wider in the squat and or the deadlift, you should probably do the specific things your coach says in powerlifting. Again, this is not for powerlifting or weightlifting. This is for training athletes with a variety of loading posterior, like methods. Okay. I use, so if you ever look up triphasic loading zones, this is essentially this foot position in zones 10 through 13 is essentially, and it would leak into 9 and 8 because there's some variations of power where I load heavier loads at the end of the week. Now getting the reverse hyper, you can see I'll have my athletes actually in a heavy load. I will go with the wide stance. Also, they'll position themselves right here so that this angle is wider also. So when they're doing reverse hyper. Now, a key factor when I coach my reverse hyper, and there's a lot of key factors to each one of these, my athletes grip this hand on the reverse hyper. They're pulling back with this lat, and then you have a sling that runs through the body, and we are stabilizing here. This arm is not stabilizing with anything. They're focused here, and then they're actually theoretically always looking in that direction, okay, as the which leg they're going. This just happens to be the case. So, and you can see that this angle is wider. The next lift, you can see same thing here, as I said before, the narrow stance between the power loading phase, which is 80 to 55, and you can see the angle is then decreased on the athlete here in the power phase when they're using a reverse hyper. This would be triphasic loading zones 9 to 5. So loading zones 9 to 5. If you want to look those up, those are available on the internet. And then the narrow stance for the glute ham hyper, you can see how this would be a more narrow stance in the lighter loading zones. I assume most people take athletes through a combination of various loading zones and not go strictly heavy all the time. So loading zones between 50 to 25%. These are triphasic loading zones 1 through 4. And you can see in the reverse hyper, athletes here, that hand's connected, lat crosses over the from this QL to this glute, and then runs down, the sling runs down this leg, but this leg is straight in line when they're in a lighter loading zones, whether they're using bands or light loads, it doesn't matter. But when the peaking model is speed, this is the format that I want, the position I want the athlete in. A few other things that we have here, you can see in the RDL, the Romanian deadlift. I'm sorry, I bumped ahead one. You can see here that the strength zones, my computer seems a little delayed here. In the strength zones with the RDL, you can see 80 to 120% with a wider stance, and the athlete here is in a power position, so it's just, we're talking 2 to 3 inches sometimes, folks, and that's really the difference. And then a more narrow stance with a light load, 50% load to 25% load of your RDLs. So that's just one example of an exercise that I'll do. Even the hip thrust, if you do this and if you choose this, you can do a wider loading zone. With heavy load, I would do a little bit wider stance. Power zone, I would do a more narrower stance. And then obviously in the speed zone, I would do a narrow stance there also, if this is an exercise you like. So seeing that position is something that you can take a look at. And my next video will kind of tie some other things into this.